No, go back.
Dave, how are you doing today?
Good enough, thank you. It'll be better soon.
Yeah, when it warms up or otherwise?
No, it's just in-house. A lot of stuff. I'm all good. I'm ready.
All right. Well, yeah, I think we need 5 people for quorum, so we're going to wait till we get to that magic number, which we might have just hit. All right, I think we did. With Shane, Peter, Caroline, Dave, myself, and Andy. All right, so let's get this meeting started here. So welcome everyone to the October 27th meeting of the Missoula Consolidated Planning Board. We are going to hold this meeting as we have been recently, virtually. So we'll be taking public comment via online format or the telephone, just like a radio show, or making a pledge during the telethon. We'll also be taking public comment via those formats. So for folks who are interested in making comment, we'll post the phone numbers and access information on the screen at each point. And we'll give you time to call in. And when you do call in, you'll be identified when it's your turn to speak by your phone number, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak. So with that, can we please have a roll call of members to determine who's present?
Thank you. Andy Mefford.
Present.
Andy Mefford's present. Peter Benson.
Here.
Peter Benson's present. Sean McCoy. Sean McCoy's absent. Stephanie Potts. Stephanie Potts will be calling in soon. Dave Loomis.
Here.
Dave Loomis is present. Josh Schrader. Josh Schrader is absent. Caroline Lauer.
Here.
Caroline Lauer is present. Neva Hassanen is absent. Shane Morrissey.
Present.
Shane Morrissey's present. Vince Caristo.
Present.
Vince Caristo is present. Mr. Chair, we have 4 regular members and 2 alternates present. Would you like to appoint both alternates as regular voting members tonight?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Next item is we'll not have approval of minutes tonight from the last meeting. That'll be deferred to a future meeting. So we'll move on to public comment from the public on items that are not on tonight's agenda. So if we could please have the call-in information on the screen. So if you'd like to make a call, to make a comment, the phone number to call is 1-253-215-8782, and the meeting ID is 960-049-3694. And when you do call in, please remember to mute your television or your computer, however you're watching the video, or else we'll get an echo and we won't be able to hear your comment. So, and when it's your turn to speak, staff will identify you by the last 4 digits of your phone number, and you will have 3 minutes to give your comment. So with that, I will go unmute myself and give time for folks to call in.
Just a note, Donna, Stephanie's trying to get in on the public forum part.
I believe that Stephanie had called in and I'd admitted her to the meeting. She seems to be muted.
Am I allowed? Oh, I did not know I was admitted. Sorry, guys. This is Stephanie and I'm here.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks again. One more time with me messing up all the audio and everything, guys. This is great.
I do have one caller in the meeting, phone number ending 6943. Could I have you identify yourself? You appear to be muted. I cannot unmute you.
This might be somebody that's part of our design workshop team.
Not certain. Nicole, are you? Yeah, it's Nicole from the design workshop team.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll just give a couple more minutes here then for anyone else to join.
I have one other number in the lobby I'm going to admit now.
Okay.
Caller with phone number ending 4054, you've been admitted to the meeting. Could you identify yourself for the record? And you may be muted.
My name is Leah Mendez.
Hi, Leah. We can hear you loud and clear. If you'd like to continue, you've got 3
Oh,
minutes.
great. Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the planning board meeting that took place last week on October 20th and thank the board members for addressing my comment regarding the Mullen Area Landscaping Code and potential incorporation of native plants. I really appreciated the conversation that sparked, and I'm eager to learn more about what staff recommends in terms of amending that code to require some minimum percentage of native plants in the Mullen area development. And yeah, I too am really interested to see what comes of the discussion regarding what constitutes as a native plant, or what kind of plant species might be on that list to be used in landscaping. So thank you guys very much, and look forward to tuning in and learning how the issue develops.
Great, thanks for your comment, Leah. And we'll be watching as well to see how our recommendations are followed through with the county commissioners and the city council. So thank you for your comment.
We have one other caller in the lobby at this point. I'm going to admit them to the meeting. Caller with phone number ending 3391. If you could identify yourself by name for the record and please make your comments.
Hi, my name is Seamus Land. Hopefully you can hear me.
Hi, Seamus. We can hear you loud and clear.
All right, great. Yeah, still getting used to that *6 unmute thing. But anyway, yeah, I'm calling. I called in the last meeting as well, and I also wanted to follow up and express my appreciation of the discussion that happened later in the meeting regarding native plants. I wanted to encourage the board to continue to pursue that line of thinking, and also really be on the right path when it comes to native plants and climate resiliency. You had mentioned a lot of developing a sense of place, and I think that's another reason to use native plants. But in addition to that, native plants are the most climate resilient and will be the most effective plant or landscaping and habitat as we face the challenges ahead. So I think that's a key element. And also, I just wanted to, again, encourage the board to plan to do the Grant Creek restoration to allot the right amount of buffer zone and to expect that to be funded. The Grant Creek restoration would be another great opportunity to create that sense of place, to restore an old creek that's been degraded, to add an educational aspect to the plan. And it would really allow people to understand that sense of place in a really integrated way, where the development fits in with the natural ecosystems and ecology, and also the native plants in the landscaping would assist with that. So with that, I think I'll wrap it up. But again, I really appreciated the conversation. I look forward to hearing it develop.
Great, thank you, Seamus. Okay, we'll give another minute or two. Okay, Heather, is there anyone in the waiting room that you can tell?
We have no callers in the lobby.
Okay, very good. Then we will move on to staff announcements. So the first item is the updated planning board schedule that was provided to us by staff. Please take a look at that. We've got a verbal update on this last week. But yeah, please take a look at that. The next item is a Title 20 update, sort of update on something that we saw here at Planning Board earlier in the year. Did you want to say anything about this, staff or Laval? Or does it stand as presented?
The City Council adopted the ordinance with the amendment that you made about retaining the process for the tourist home, 2 notices. And they ended up pulling back on any changes to the conditional use process because it became clear after your discussion and amendments, and then further investigation of how it would work and what the processes could look like, that we really weren't quite ready yet. So we wanted to take more time to think about that and be a little more intentional by looking at examples and thinking about that process in a little more detail. So we are committed to coming back to it in another cycle of amendments, but we did take that one out completely. So that was it, really. I mean, they approved everything else as it stood, and I want to thank you for your discussion.
Great. Well, thank you, Laval, for following up on this with us. It's great to kind of be able to track what our recommendations, where they go and how they're reacted to. And I guess you win some and you lose some. So this is really great to hear the update. So thank you. And the next item, maybe Donna, if you want to say a few words about what we're moving to in the future in terms of our online platform.
We are moving towards webinar November, December, which should help a lot with our public presence and the public participation. You will get invitations as panelists, and they will be able to join it as a participant, and they can see everything live time without trying to switch between YouTube and their telephone. So I think there's good changes coming.
Great, that sounds fantastic. This is, we've all been very patient and figured out a way to work this, but it's it's pretty numbing, I think we can all agree. So that sounds great. So moving on to our public hearings for tonight, of which we have none. So tonight we have one presentation from the city on the subdivision and townhouse exemption development review project that we've heard about earlier this year. So Laval and Jessica, please take it away.
Hi, this is Laval Means with the Planning Department for Development Services. And just briefly, I wanted to remind you that we've been working on this project of an assessment of our current land development regulations, focusing a lot on process, but also the current regulations, looking at best practices and local examples. And out of that, we will be getting a recommendations report that gives us an idea of how to move forward with making changes that are intentional, that are comprehensive, that are going to help to make a difference on housing development, and gives us a roadmap for how we go forward. I have today with us the consultants that have been working on this project, Jessica Garrow and Nicole Rebeck-Stout. Jessica will walk us through a presentation. We're open to pauses at different points for questions and conversation. And Ben Brewer is joining us as well. He's been pretty instrumental in our review and our process and familiarity about certain types of projects. So that's who you have here to help with any of the discussion. I'll hand it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Laval. I'm going to try to share my screen here and let me know if you can see just a PowerPoint slide. Okay. Great. So thank you, everyone, for having us. Tonight, we are really excited to go through the recommendations report with you. This is the design workshop team who has been working on this report. And as Laval mentioned, Nicole's on the line with us tonight. So what we really wanted to go through with you tonight is a review of the recommendations report, the progress that we've made, understand what feedback the planning board has, and answer any questions that you might have about the process or the report. We'll go through just an overview of all of the community engagement process and the work that we've done, go through some of our analysis, and then we wanted to spend the bulk of the time tonight going through the actual draft recommendations report itself to see what is missing, what questions you have, and what changes you might be interested in seeing. So I wanted to start with a quick overview of the project goals. You saw this slide when we met with you back in the late spring, early summer. And it's just a highlight of why have we been going through this. And while we have been focused on the subdivision and the TED regulations, I think we've tried to be pretty broad about how we think through the city's process and the community engagement process that land development applications go through, as well as kind of city perspective. So we've focused on the outcomes. We've focused on a report that's going to lead to land use review process that's easier to administer from a city perspective and easier to understand from a community perspective, as well as from a development perspective. So in order to do that, the process that we use from an engagement perspective, we have used Missoula's new Engage Missoula platform. Since the beginning of the project, we've had some background information, all the information that we've provided with to our working group, and then some opportunities for open community engagement. We also completed a number of interviews and got a lot of perspectives about the city's process overall as it relates to development. Laval participated in a city radio interview and helped push participation to an online survey. And we've had meetings with LUP as well as planning board. our community questionnaire really had diverse community representation. We were really excited about that. We had over 120 people participate in that survey. And we also had an environmental focus group via an online questionnaire. So I wanted to go through some of what we heard from the community as it relates to the land use process and subdivision and TED. So in the community questionnaire, we asked, what are the most important topics that this project really needs to be thinking about and helping solve for? When we get to a recommendations report, what should those recommendations really be about? How can we support Missoula in moving forward on some of these things? So you'll see high votes for creating affordable housing. So we've continued to use the lens of affordable housing creation throughout this process. Some interest in predictability, improving the comment process, but a lot of comments as well about being consistent with values and making sure that the regulations align with policy documents and the values of the community. That's another item that we've really kept top of mind as we've been going through this process. From the environmental focus group, we really tried to dig into some of the more specific aspects of subdivision regulations and land use regulations more generally. And it was kind of interesting. And so I just pulled one of these questions up as some of the important topics that group identified as needing to make sure that they're incorporated and accounted for within the development regulations. So lots of focus on steep slopes, access to food, preservation of agricultural soils and prime ag areas, as well as access to river and waterways. So those are things that we've tried to highlight in some of the recommendations as being important.
Jessica, could I ask a question on those? Yeah. These aren't necessarily value questions per se. Is the question what people think needs change or what people value in general?
It's these questions were really focused on what are the values that need to be incorporated into a code and into the process. So this is not identifying something that's necessarily wrong or that needs to be changed. It's make sure that the code recognizes and addresses these issues.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions on the engagement process, either the community questionnaire or this environmental focus group, before I go into best practices, case studies, and state law?
Jessica, there's other aspects of what you probably got out of the environment focus group that will be delivered as part of its own summary and make its way into the final document. This is a highlight of some of the key things, or a key question, right?
Yeah, and so what you have in your packet, and it's available on Engage Missoula right now, is a draft of the recommendations report. And the environmental questionnaire was still out, and we were kind of still getting some comments as we were pulling that draft together. So you'll notice that that's not in the report, but as Lavelle mentioned, we'll be adding that and some additional detail to the recommendations report related to this specific focus group. All right. So in terms of analysis, we completed a number of different pieces to understand the process in Missoula and compare it to national best practices. So we did a pretty lengthy best practice analysis focusing on code innovations within specific areas and themes that I'll get into in a moment. We completed 4 case studies covering both subdivisions and TEDs. And we really specifically chose those based off of different geographies and making sure that we were covering the diversity of project types in Missoula. We completed a state law analysis that focused on the state law requirements. Montana is very unique in how prescriptive the subdivision regulations are. And so we did a deeper dive into that and understanding what exemptions are allowed, what processes are required, and where might there be opportunities to adjust Missoula's code to better align with state law. And then we also completed an existing code analysis that really focused quite a bit on process, because as we went through our interviews and the case studies, we really started to hear a lot of themes around adjustments to process. And so we focused on that in our code analysis.
Jessica, could you do me a favor? And I'm hearing like I don't know if anyone else is hearing that background sound. It's sort of distracting for me. It's stopped now. It sounded like a printer. Okay, never mind. Okay, it stopped.
Okay.
Please continue.
Might have been my sweater. I'll move it away from my sweater.
Yeah, I don't know if we could maybe mute everyone else. Maybe that would, if I could ask Heather to maybe mute everyone for a second, and then Jessica, you could unmute yourself. That might solve it. Oh, okay. Jessica, it was you. So please continue. Thanks.
Can folks hear me okay? My computer is sounding like it's about to lift off, which I can't really do much about, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's okay. It's not awful. So.
All right, so for best practices, I mentioned there were some themes that we focused on. The first was related to the public comment process, and we discovered a number of best practices in the state and nationally related to kind of how that public comment process works. So opportunities to have innovative mailers, adjustments to the neighborhood meeting, some opportunities for administrative review of certain projects with written comment period. So we reviewed that. Another theme was related to housing opportunities, and we focused on best practices related to density and parking. Streamlined process, so focused on land dedication requirements specific to parklands. Looking at handouts and checklists, things that are relatively easy and on the administrative side that can help clarify process requirements. We looked at some best practices related to unified development codes or ordinances, UDOs. And then finally, final theme in best practices was looking at policy alignment and where have communities found opportunities to align their policy documents within their land use codes. From a case study perspective, there were a number of lessons learned as we went through those 4 case studies. And I won't read everything on the slide, but they fell into kind of some process lessons learned, as I mentioned, and some regulatory lessons learned. Some of the key things that came out were the wins, and that projects where they had proactive conversations with their neighbors, and as well as with development services, those tended to be more successful and have a quicker process than projects that didn't do that. And then a lot of comments that development services is kind of supportive and is a good department to work with. From a state law perspective, we reviewed, as I mentioned, exemptions and various requirements. And really in general, Missoula's code meets the state law requirements. There are some things that don't quite align with state law. So for instance, a parks calculation when the density is not known is slightly lower than what the state allows. So that's included in the recommendations report as something to consider. There's also more articulation in Missoula's code about what is required at a pre-application phase and things like that. So it kind of cuts both ways, but generally the Missoula code matches what's required in state law. We did find some opportunities related to hierarchy in regulations, some of the requirements related to pre-application documents, and some opportunities for administrative reviews. From an existing code analysis, we again really focused on process because that was some of the things that we heard, and found some opportunities for timelines to make sure that those are all incorporated within the code. The role of development services relative to other departments was another kind of opportunity that we saw, and you'll see in the recommendations. There's maybe some opportunities for simplification at the pre-application phase, as well as when the neighborhood meeting occurs. A lot of the feedback that we have heard in this process is that the neighborhood meeting is either maybe too soon in the process or too late in the process, depending on what the intention is. And so we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to that recommendation. So all of this then relates to what are kind of the overall impacts and issues that we've found in the research, in the conversations, and in the engagement. And they fall into kind of three buckets. Impacts to the community, impacts to the city, and impacts to development. From a community perspective, the requirements in the code, the process that development goes through has created some barriers to new housing supply and reduced access to affordable homes. City policies are really not fully implemented in the code right now, and those are policies that the community helped shape. So that's an impact. There's maybe a conversation that should be had about balancing the need for community to know about changes that are happening in their neighborhood with the rights of the property owner who is pursuing development. There's maybe a balance there that needs to be discussed and rethought. And then also making sure that short-term and long-term benefits of impact are really recognized and balanced within the regulations. From a city impact perspective, because the process is maybe a little bit confusing for developers or for community members, there tend to be kind of a lot of repeated questions that are coming to staff that maybe have been answered once or answered by someone and then another person is answering them. So there's kind of duplicative workload there. There's maybe some additional review time and responsibilities that city staff has to complete. And we've really found that the workload that city staff takes on as it relates to development review is much larger than the current staffing is probably equipped to handle. From a development perspective, some of those impacts are, a longer process means that they incur additional holding costs, additional costs that are passed on to a future homeowner. When development needs to rework things, there's additional cost that's associated with that and can again be passed on to the homeowner. And some developers indicated concern that they are not able to offer creative solutions for some of these issues. So I wanted to pause there and see if there were any questions kind of how we got to some of these impacts based off of the research, and happy to also dive into any of the specific pieces on best practices or case studies if you have any questions there.
Caroline.
Yeah, thank you for this. I was wondering if you could speak more to the point of city policies not fully realized. Were there any specifically that came to mind, or was this just a general sentiment? Just any additional context on that you could provide.
Sure. So one example is kind of the housing policies speaking about housing affordability and diversity within housing types. And because there are some specific requirements related to either how you calculate your density when it relates to sloped lots, for instance, or some of those things that can impact the amount of housing that can be developed. There's maybe a linkage there that could be analyzed and updated. There were a few comments during our interviews that a developer who maybe felt like they were complying with the growth policy, but it was not really carried through into the zoning that was on that property, that there was some kind of confusion there and frustration. And so it's kind of a general statement, but those are two examples that we heard and found in the process.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
I had a question. Can you hear me okay? I'm curious what if there was anything that came up about how or what the role of the planning board was in this process. You know, is it a necessary drag on the workload that the staff has? Should the role of the board be, or could it be optimized? And if so, how?
Yeah, so one of the best practice examples that we looked at was from, I think, Bozeman. And for minor subdivisions, they've outlined a process where instead of going to the planning board, that first step is completed at a staff level. There's still a public comment period. There's no public hearing, but there's a public comment period. And that was kind of identified as a change that could be made to help streamline Missoula's process without really necessarily negatively impacting the outcomes that would happen. And that's a delegation that's very clearly allowed in state law. There were also some conversations around regulations based off of geography and based off of scale, and that maybe proposals in certain areas where you might expect development and they're relatively consistent with the code and the growth policy, that those might have more expedited process that might skip planning board or might not. Kind of a conversation for the future, but that was something that was identified as are there things that we're maybe generally okay with that don't need to have all of the steps that a project goes through right now.
And Jessica, I don't want to, I guess I'll just clarify that the minor subdivisions in Missoula don't go to planning board either. Those go to the Land Use and Planning Committee. There's still some public opportunity for comment there, but it's it's not administrative, but it also isn't before the planning board.
And Jessica, just to clarify, I mean, a lot of what we see in terms of subdivision projects and TED projects, we don't see TED projects, but it's required by state law, right, to come to planning board.
Some things are, and then there are a number of exemptions that you can adopt through the process. And those are some of the things that are included in the recommendations report. So as an example, there could be some adjustments that you make to cluster subdivision regulations that would have a different process and could skip some of the steps. Same thing with the infrastructure exemption and growth policy, where a community has an adopted growth policy and they've done some additional work to understand and really quantify that infrastructure is available to serve that subdivision. In that situation, it could skip some of the steps. So it's really about taking advantage of some of those exemptions that are in state law.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so wanted to talk through the issues. And so you'll see these issues then trickle into the actual recommendations, which we'll get to next. So issues were really fell into two buckets: administrative and regulatory, or regulations. There were a lot of kind of comments and things that we found as we went through the process, that there's opportunities for improved clarity. There's going to be opportunities for more consistency within the review process and the review team. There's a real staff capacity issue, and there are some timeline opportunities. From a regulations perspective, there's really limited flexibility within Missoula's regulations right now for someone who wants to come forward with a kind of innovative, different design for a subdivision. There are some conflicts between regulations and the adopted policies that should be part of longer term work and code amendments. Again, kind of a larger workload, which can impact review times. And then policies and regulations are not prioritized, or they're kind of not recognized for different geographies. And so those are some of the things that go into our recommendations. So the recommendations report itself is divided into a couple of different sections. The first section is administrative. And what we've done is we've outlined a number of improvements that could be made to the process and to the code. Within the administrative bucket, we've identified updating checklists and flowcharts as really a short-term opportunity that the city has to create some clarity for everyone involved in the process, whether it is staff, community, a review board, or a developer, that having a clearer set of checklists and flowcharts of this is when I trigger a minor subdivision, this is when I trigger major, or this is when I could do a TED, that is something that could be relatively easily implemented and would be really helpful for overall understanding. The second recommendation in this section is about creating a project review team with a champion within the city. Some of the things that we heard in the case studies was developer would come in and meet with a staff person, feel like they had an answer, and then that reviewer would change, and they might feel like they got a different answer from the next reviewer. And so creating a project team, and then also recommendation 3, creating a process for documenting decisions and milestones, those kind of go hand in hand to create some consistency within the process. From the city side, that also creates consistency in their review, so that a city reviewer who is kind of new to a project and gets thrown in at the last minute, that would happen less often if you're adopting kind of a standardized project review team within an individual project, as well as documenting those milestones. And that can also decrease the amount of planner shopping that might be happening with staff. Any questions on these 3 recommendations or concerns about them, I guess? So 3 more recommendations within this administrative section. Recommendation 4 is to require key agencies to be present at scoping or pre-application meetings. So this was something that we heard as sometimes a key person or a key agency was not participating in some of these early meetings, and that led to some rework and additional cost that a project had to take on in order to address some of those comments. So this is really just about having, again, some consistency within the early phases of a project. Recommendation 5 is creating a development process manual. Right now, there's a public works manual that is underway, and we've identified kind of completing that as a really important short-term implementation strategy. We think that that is going to help some of the clarity around public works requirements. Once that's been in place for a while, we recommend kind of looking at it and seeing if it makes sense to create that for the development process more generally. But that is a really good best practice that can help clarify some of the requirements within a code. And then our final recommendation in this section was to increase staff capacity for development project review. Some kind of short to long-term recommendations are included in this one. Really understanding staffing needs right now and supporting learning for existing staff and supporting existing staff and making sure that they feel up to speed on the code and on the requirements. And then understanding where are there gaps that need to be filled by additional people, and updating job descriptions, and then really being ready when funding is available to pull the trigger and be able to hire to address some of the capacity issues. And that's the last on the administrative. So curious if there's any comments or questions on that set of 6 recommendations.
I have a couple of comments, Jessica. Couple comments. A4, I think, is really important. Many times I have attended these scoping meetings, and we're talking about TEDs, I thought, but then I hear a discussion about subdivisions and other things coming up as well. So it seems like somewhat of a broader discussion, but I have attended a number of these scoping meetings or pre-apps that get set up, take weeks to get set up. And then you go there and the decision makers are frequently not there, or key personnel are not there. And so we have these understandings, or we walk out thinking we have somewhere, or we've met something, and then weeks go on and we find out, no, person A went and talked to person B, and what we had understood or thought we had understood isn't reality. You know, it's the fire department isn't showing up, or the water company, or the sewer, or street sections, or just a lot of those things. So getting those stakeholders at that meeting early on and understanding what the expectations are is a huge issue. The secondary issue is this maybe process of knowing where you are, because we frequently submit stuff and it goes into oblivion. No one knows where it is. We don't know what stage we're on, who's on first. So maybe this project representative or something, it would almost feel like it would be a better process to have, like, I understand, like building permits, where you have a number, a project number. We get wrapped up in city project numbers right away. We don't even know what those project numbers are or how they get assigned, but it would be nice if there was a portal as a developer representative. You could log in and find your project number and say, hey, the stage 3 checklist we submitted has been received and it's been reviewed, or so you know where you're at, because we go on for weeks sometimes trying to figure out who's on first or where it's at or if it was received, and it's lost in the shuffle. And so that's a lot of lost time and frustration. So getting those stakeholders at a meeting and then having some kind of a documented process so you know where you are would be a really good step, whether it's a TED, a minor subdivision, or a major.
Yeah, I think that's pretty consistent with some of the feedback that we've heard. And I think there's an opportunity to add some clarity on A4 and on the documenting decisions and process.
I'd like to add, Andy, we miss you. I miss having these conversations with you involved. You add perspective that we don't have in other places.
Well, thanks. I would like to get back to in-person meetings, but I'm not sure how soon that's going to happen. So.
Any other comments on this section?
Jessica, is the Public Works manual, is that separate and apart from what you're proposing, or the same thing?
So it is a little of both. I think our full recommendation is to have a development process manual that covers not just public works, but the whole range of requirements for a project. That said, because the Public Works manual is in the works right now, we think a really important short-term step is to complete that and have a few projects kind of under your belt and see how that works, so that there's some lessons learned about how you could implement that as a full development process manual.
Okay, thanks.
So Vince,
Yes, Dave.
sorry, a little late, but on A6, staff capacity, I mean, it's obvious the city has always had that problem, how to recruit, train and maintain adequate staff. And so I'm just wondering if we're going to talk about that later, about how the planning board can urge and the governing body of the city specifically, you know, they keep falling behind. That's just a history, and it's really tough. But many of these complaints, historically and even present, have to do with adequate staff. I think the staff that's there is working really hard and doing well. And I think the expectations on what staff can do now are too high, given what the department has been given by the city council. And that's just my take on it. And if we're going to pick up on that later, I hope we do.
Dave, I've made that note, and we'll see if there's anything else to add to this report to help outline how individual boards might support this recommendation. Okay. Our next set of recommendations relate to code and state law, and there's a long list here, and so I have tried to break these down into manageable pieces so we can talk through these. First recommendation is related to an administrative review process and delegating certain subdivisions to the planning director for review, and establishing an expedited review process based on specific criteria, so that maybe smaller projects could have a quicker path to approval. These are some best practices that we pulled from Bozeman and Billings because they're really pretty specific to Montana state law. So there's just not a lot of national best practices that are relevant here. But we're recommending looking at ways to expedite some of the kind of smaller projects. Any comments or questions on these?
Yeah, I do have one question. Just so this is Stephanie. I'm calling in, so you can't see my face right now. But I'm actually I'm in the process of moving to the Gallatin Valley, and one thing that I think is pretty commonly known and that's pretty clear here is that housing isn't affordable here, and there's a lot of development happening. But they're big houses and they're not affordable and they're far out driving distance. And just in general, like I think about the planning that the planning board did in the Mullen area master plan and in recent discussions that we've had in Missoula, and in sort of preventing some of those, unchecked developments from happening. And so I'm just curious, because I'm sure you guys thought this through in your recommendations. How do you balance that if one of the things that the planning board or the land use planning committee does and serves an important role is being that citizen review committee about how we want things to look for the future of our community. And so, I fully trust city staff right now, but I also think that there's an important role that citizens play in that process. And so what would you recommend is a good way to balance that moving forward? Because I totally understand the need to simultaneously reduce this workload on city staff. So how can we do that, but make sure that those values are maintained in how we develop in Missoula?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there are some later recommendations that really focus on aligning regulations to the policy documents. I'll really quickly skip ahead. So the 4 is specific, align regulations to policy documents. But what we have found is that there are some current policies within the growth policy that are not necessarily reflected in zone districts, and that there's an opportunity there to align your code allowances and code requirements with what the community has said is appropriate as it relates to growth. And so that is one way to help balance that. And if you have gone through a really detailed public engagement process as it relates to the growth policy or to the housing policy, which we know Missoula has done, then presumably the items in there have had kind of a good public hearing, so to speak, and could be implemented in code through exemptions or a faster process for certain things that the community has said, we want that, we think it's a priority. So whether that's tiny homes or higher density in certain areas, that might be a way to link it back to the code and give that project a faster process.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that explanation.
Anything else on these two? Okay. All right. Our third recommendation in this section is related to the neighborhood meeting. We had a lot of comment and conversation with the Land Use Policy Committee about this. We've had a lot of conversation with the working group about this, and it kind of came through in all of the engagement. So there's a lot within this one recommendation. I think one of the things that we have identified is that the neighborhood meeting requirement in Missoula probably happening at the wrong time. It's happening before a public hearing, which is good, but it's happening so far into the process that a developer has already spent quite a bit of time and effort and money to design the project, and is sometimes reticent to make adjustments based off of that neighborhood meeting. So we're suggesting a couple of things to help address this. The first is to establish some best practices and handouts about what should be happening at the neighborhood meeting, who should be participating, and provide that guide for both neighborhood councils as well as the development community, so that there's some clarity and expectations about what can actually happen through the neighborhood meeting process. The second short-term recommendation related to this is implementing staff attendance at neighborhood meetings. That could be for some of the larger projects as opposed to every single kind of small subdivision. But we think having staff there to help answer questions, to help clarify requirements, would be really helpful from the neighborhood council perspective and community members who are participating. In terms of medium-term recommendations, we do think that there's an opportunity to adjust the requirements based off of neighborhood types. So something that is a relatively small project, a minor subdivision, could have a meeting or provide an informational mailer if they so choose. Whereas the large subdivision would continue to have that neighborhood meeting, but providing some nuance and difference based off of the project type. We're also recommending that kind of other comment methods be considered as opposed to the kind of one in-person or now virtual neighborhood meeting, that the city could use the Engage Missoula platform. They could hold a different type of kind of mailer or online forum where people don't have to come at a specific time, but could provide kind of longer term comment on something. And then finally, we're recommending that the neighborhood meeting really occur prior to the pre-application meeting. Unless there's changes to what is required at the pre-application phase, we think having the neighborhood have an opportunity to comment earlier in the process is going to be more impactful for projects to make changes. Any comments or questions on this? Because there's kind of a lot within the recommendations report related to the neighborhood meeting.
Jessica, I have one question. We've heard from time to time people say they didn't hear about a neighborhood meeting, or there was one sign in the neighborhood and it just wasn't noticed. The information wasn't gotten out in the best way. Is that something you looked at, and what did you find in terms of noticing requirements for these projects?
Yeah, so what some of the other communities, Fort Collins is a good example, is that the same list that is used for a required public hearing, the 300-foot radius, they are required to send a mailed notice out. Other communities have a requirement that you post. There's a poster there that identifies this as when the neighborhood meeting is happening and could link to a website or things like that. I think it's really hard to make sure that every single person is always aware of a public hearing or a neighborhood meeting, despite really everyone's best efforts. And so that's one reason why, as a short-term recommendation, we're saying just let's establish some standardized best practices and handouts and engaging the neighborhood councils in that to help make sure that the best practices that are identified, the process that is used, is actually working for the community members.
Thanks.
Anything else on neighborhood meeting? Okay.
Well, I guess
Go ahead.
I have one comment I was thinking about. Sorry if it's kind of obvious, but it's kind of a no-win situation. And I feel badly for the staff that have to attend these. People don't know when it's the right time to complain. They don't have their radar on at the right point. I remember particular meetings that have come to the planning board where it all, focused on stormwater drainage, which was not a consideration until the very last stages of development. Or, for instance, in the Mullen area plan, that we now have people who are really interested in native vegetation. That did not arise at the beginning of these conversations. So it strikes me that this is a really difficult implementation problem. I commend you for trying to do it, but I'm not optimistic that you're going to find a lot of solution here. I guess that's what I have to say.
Yeah, this is one of the more difficult ones, I think, in the report. And we've tried to outline a couple of different ways because we're not sure that one way is going to be the thing that kind of solves this issue, right? I think you've got to tackle it from a couple of different angles and continue to, as a city, be willing to hear feedback on what's working and what's not from a neighborhood perspective and from a developer perspective. Because it is so important, I think, to the public process that the community know what's happening and understand when they should be making comment and when things are at a point where it's just kind of so final that you can't go back. And so just making sure that you hit that sweet spot is important. All right. Our next set, we've kind of mentioned aligning regulations to policy documents. One of the specific recommendations within this section is to maybe go through and identify some what we've called pre-approved variations or pre-approved deviations from subdivision requirements, where a project would not necessarily need to go through a variance process, because if they meet some specific requirements that the city has approved, they could have narrower streets, or they could have a slightly different park dedication, or kind of identifying what are those things where the city's willing to take a more innovative or a slightly different solution in the built environment, and have those kind of pre-approved that an applicant could indicate that they're including in their development. So that is kind of one specific short-term recommendation. And then finally, making sure there's an update to some of the zoning tools as part of implementing growth policy and housing policy within the code. The fifth recommendation in this category is related to the TED process. And one of the things that's important to highlight is Missoula is the only community that we're aware of in Montana that utilizes the townhome exemption development process. The state law is very short. It's essentially 2 lines. There's not a lot of direction there. And we think Missoula has done a really good job kind of using that lack of direction to create a process that works and is compliant with state law. I think we kind of wished there were maybe more language in the state law to provide you with some direction and support, but barring that, we think that the program is generally working. There's maybe some improvements that could be made as it relates to information that's asked throughout the process, and identifying what things could be reviewed at a building permit as opposed to during the TED review itself. We also think there's maybe some opportunities to look again, reevaluate the number of units that are allowed for a TED based off of either an area with a master plan, so like the Mullen area, for instance, or for different geographies. So I'll pause there and see if there's any comments specific to the TED process.
Jessica, I just had one comment to that, I guess. I guess this kind of dovetails back to this, and I realize in this community, this is probably a bridge too far, but I'll just add this. You made the comment that Missoula is the only place in the state doing this. There's other large municipalities experiencing tremendous growth, Flathead, Bozeman, Billings, and they're all deciding without these set of regulations that we've adopted, that they've figured out that management of it through zoning and stuff, which was the parent that was driving it, said, if you comply with zoning, this has been vetted and you should be good to go, which dovetails back to the staff workload comment, I guess, is where I'm going. We've created a set of regulations and mounted on more regulations, more boxes to check, more checklists to create, which takes away staff time to go do something that one could argue every other municipality in the state has been able to do without those regulations. So maybe that time could be spent doing something entirely different where it's more focused. I don't know. I realized that there was an intention to create that. I would be an advocate of saying we didn't need to create the TED exemption to begin with, because there was addressed in state law and zoning and things was good enough for others, you know, that would be one way to free up staff time to work on other things.
Andy, are you talking mostly about the conditional use approval that we have, or something else?
No, I'm talking about the townhome exemption development process that was created and put into the development code, Title 20. You know, that whole section was edited and added in. And whenever it was added, I was an advocate to not add it at all. I was an advocate of, we don't need this. similar to other things that I've been an advocate of. Overlay districts, you know, designed excellence, a number of things, which I've voiced my opposition to on numerous occasions. But we have enough work with Title 20 and keeping it up to date, and we create more regulations, more, which takes more complexity. It takes more staff. It takes more enforcement. It takes more regulations. It creates conflict. It takes staff. It adds cost. And we come back to arguing about affordable housing. All those things are maybe not creating the ultimate gap, but they're not making us get any closer, I guess, is my point. So it isn't about the design exception, but more about process, that we added a process that was believed to be necessary. And I guess I could just be a proponent to argue maybe it's not necessary.
I see. Thanks for clarifying, Andy.
And I'll add that in our work, we are recommending TED be continued, but that it really be looked at to make sure that it is the streamlined version that's anticipated and kind of intended by state law. So one of the more kind of nitty-gritty recommendations is to kind of reevaluate and look at, is this TED ownership unit for the land something that is really needed, or could that be removed and we go through kind of a more regular condominiumization process or other process? So that's just an example.
Stephanie.
Vince, this is Stephanie. I would love to share a perspective, and I really appreciate this discussion. I think it brings up some really good things to think about. And Andy, your perspective about not wanting to add undue burden to staff is really important. I think I just want to share that it's not like this created a whole new set of regulations. What TED exemptions are is an exemption from subdivision review. And so yes, Missoula has a more onerous process than Butte and Billings does, but it's still a less onerous process than having all of those pieces of land go through a full subdivision review. And so I appreciate the staff or the consultants and the staff, and they're really thought about how can we make this more efficient. But I guess just to think about that process too, that we the state has delegated to the counties through citizen-run boards the duty basically to review these things, and then they have granted certain exemptions, but said that they leave it vague for a reason. My experience from working at the state legislature during times when you look at these exemptions in state law, you're working with people who we're trying to make it so each county can do what's right for them. And I think it's really nice, just as you were saying, if we're going to take away some of these citizen review processes in Missoula, I feel like it's important for us to put sideboards on how far that's going to go. And that's totally legitimate for the counties to want to do. So I guess I would just encourage that we think about, like, it's not a completely new process that we're adding just because we want to make townhome exemption a thing that has to go through review. We're taking away the need for subdivision review. We're giving them a different process that still helps to maintain those community values. And how can we do that in a way that's also efficient for staff? And I think it's really important to not throw out the baby with the bathwater of citizen involvement in the process of things. That's something we have in a home rule state, and it's really special. We shouldn't give it up. We should keep that citizens review to some extent, but still balance it. So.
I would agree. And my recollection on the TED process, it was the city used it in self-defense for people using the side door to do large subdivisions. And then they worked really hard at figuring out how to accommodate that in a really awkward position. I personally think the city did a good job of figuring out, okay, we're not abdicating our job here as the city and as citizen groups, and that's my understanding of how this came about. And everything should be re-looked at since the legislature really opened a gate. The city wanted to say, not so fast. We want to be able to control this, and this is what they came up with, and that's my take on it.
Well, Val, you want to add something, please?
Sure. I just wanted to kind of clarify what I understood is happening around the state. And that is that nobody is using the state law townhome exemption, not the added layers of a process even, but the exemptions is not being used by other jurisdictions. And we've talked to other planning directors and some of these other cities. So if I'm mistaken in that, I'd love to know those places, but that's our understanding. It's not that it's just that it's not being used by other places. And Missoula has looked at it as a tool for streamlining and is trying to find that balance, as I think you all are recognizing.
Didn't we see, or didn't we review a set of changes to the TED process last year? I'm curious how those have been going. Is this like the next iteration of changes, or are they all different, or did some of them not work out as intended?
And actually, Ben is with us. So yes, you did look at amendments last year. And after that, it was really apparent that it was important to look at all the land development regulations, not just that one tool of TED, to really, part of the impetus for this project was that one affects the other, and we really wanted to understand the desirability of the TED and what can we do with our other regulations, our subdivision regulations, to address improvements in those processes. But beyond that, I think Ben actually just did some recent recognition of a number of projects that are being pursued. So maybe Ben could just speak to what's going on.
Sure, and I don't know if I caught the question. Were you wondering what TEDs have come through recently, or what the
Ben, thanks. I was curious how the changes have gone, how things have gone since changes went through last year.
Sure, and just as a really quick recap, the basic changes were that we limited the scope that of a project that the TED exemption could be used for. So we implemented a size cap of either up to 10 or up to 20 dwelling units for a single TED project. And as part of that, we removed the conditional use requirement entirely. And so it's all an administrative review process. We do that through the zoning compliance permit review, and then it goes from there to being ready to file the declaration based on as part of or after that approval. And so I haven't really been involved directly with kind of the more recent reviews, but my understanding is that we've had a couple, one definitely kind of larger TED that I think was 14 or 15 units that has been in the review process, which would clearly have been a conditional use project under the previous regulations. And then I think probably around 12 to 15 smaller TEDs, and those are anything from there's an existing home and they're adding a home to that property and then using TED to make them both available for separate ownership, to 4 or 5 new units, a lot, and that's kind of in line with I think what we were aiming for with what the goal of this was, which was to kind of focus TED to be a tool for infill development, and it was to make that review process streamlined and hopefully lead to those residential units coming online more quickly.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. So in this process, are you thinking or recommending, Jessica, that the unit limitations go up from 10 units or down?
We are recommending potentially increasing those in certain areas. So one example would be in an area with a master plan where there's been some conversation and expectation around development that is going to occur, that might be an opportunity to increase the number of units. Similarly, certain infill areas, it might make sense to increase those unit caps.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm figuring out exactly the right number is a really hard thing to do. But overall, I mean, it seemed like last year that we were on the right track with fitting TED into our community's needs, the way Stephanie described really, really well. So thanks.
So the next three recommendations are specific to some of the allowances within the development regulations. So looking at an opportunity to create some parameters, sideboards about some flexibility and building that into the process so that the development community can be maybe a little bit more innovative on their street and block design, transportation design to enable additional density and additional housing for affordability reasons. Also recommending encouraging accessory dwelling units and cottage homes. We're not totally sure, but I think one of the things that we're really interested in and is worth a conversation is allowing ADUs within TED developments. Right now they're specifically restricted, and we think that could be an opportunity to create some additional density within projects, is removing that prohibition. The other piece is removing minimum lot size requirements for ADUs and cottage homes, again, trying to provide opportunities for increased density. And then really kind of a nitty gritty code calculation, but making sure that the code allows density based off of the gross lot area. Right now, Missoula has some lot reductions in that density calculation for hillsides and floodplains. We're suggesting that that be removed and that you still prohibit development in those sensitive lands, kind of going back to some of the feedback from the environmental group questionnaire, but allowing that full density on the full parcel size. Any questions on these three?
I had a question about the rewarding innovation. Is there space to reward things that are more than the density issues that you mentioned? Like in the Mullen Area Master Plan, for instance, there were incentives for including electric vehicle stations or having solar energy on site. You know, I can think of a couple of different climate-related things with building performance or air filtration for wildfire smoke episodes. That's very specific, but I was just wondering if there was any discussion on doing something like that.
Not that specific, and I think that's something that we could incorporate here and kind of bolster this recommendation. We really focused on ways there could be innovation and flexibility within the pretty strict subdivision standards. So how wide can the street be? How are you connecting? So we really focused there, but I think that it's a really good point, and there's an opportunity to add some language about that.
Thanks. Yeah, it reminded me of your earlier points of aligning the values that this community has outlined already and perhaps providing some incentives for developers who are interested in doing that.
So on CP8, did I hear right or misunderstood, having to do with steep slopes and using and not subtracting on the density yield, or is that still in place? I'm not sure I heard correctly on CP8.
That's correct. Right now, there's you still deduct steep slopes from your density calculation. We're suggesting that Missoula should not do that anymore and should use the full parcel size.
Okay, I'm not, okay. I don't support that, but that's, put that out there. Thank you.
So I'm interested, Dave, to hear some more about that. We've specifically included in this recommendation that any areas that are in these sensitive lands should continue to have no development. Development should be prohibited in those areas, but that in an effort to provide additional housing stock and variety of housing, that the land area should be calculated for your density.
Okay, I get what you're saying. I don't think people should be rewarded on steep slopes, and I'm talking, you know, maybe 20% for buying those properties and then saying, give me all the density here. Making that fit, and given the other issues that we have in town about drainage and runoff and steep slopes and how to handle them, my personal experience is that's extremely difficult. And the irony of it, to me, is it's very expensive if you get too much density on steep slopes. Then the actual solution is you let somebody downslope suffer the consequences, or you have some pretty expensive engineering solutions. That's my take.
I'm interested if the rest of the planning board agrees with that. 'Cause part of what we want to do tonight is understand what the planning board thinks about these recommendations and make some adjustments before we finalize the full report.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll maybe weigh in here, and I guess I kind of think that I agree with the recommendation, actually. I think, and you know, I think what I'm hearing is that if you know a site is 50% undevelopable because of steep slope standards or protecting watersheds or anything like that, if that's deemed undevelopable, you can just squeeze twice as much density on the half of the parcel that's determined to be developable. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that seems like a win-win in that the community gets to protect those spaces that they deem to be you know, protectable, and the developer gets to develop the allotted number of units per the zoning recommendation or the growth policy or whatever the overriding document might be. I think that it makes a lot of sense, and I guess I would just maybe disagree with Dave on that.
I guess I would add my opinion on that matter too. I think it is a good thing to do that, to promote an incentive to increase the density on the areas. I was a little confused in Dave's comment. It almost sounded like he was thinking that they were developing on the steep slopes, and it is expensive and, you know, difficult to develop on those steep slopes. And as I understood it, it would not be promotion of those development on the 25% and up. It would restrict the development still, but it would just allow a density bonus on the lands that were less than 25, if I understood correctly. I guess the other comment I had to that is, would you still do the density computation and get the reduction on the slopes, or would it be treated as not density reduced calculations in the density reduction calculations for those slopes?
You would not reduce your density for those slopes. You could not build on those slopes, but you would not decrease your density calc.
Dave, you're muted.
I'm still muted. I didn't know if there was someone else speaking before. I guess I just have a couple questions because I think that what Dave is saying brings up a lot of interesting points, especially in a county where only about 8% of our land is flat. So I don't know that there are answers to these questions, but I do hear the concern of making this a blanket rule in the area, because like my question is, in a specific case, we recently looked at a subdivision that was, if there was a conflict over the agricultural land that was in it, the area over by Macaulay Butte, and then the steep slopes. And as a planning board, we didn't really have an issue with the steep slopes necessarily in those houses that were there, but under subdivision review, it was that agricultural land. So my question would be, one of them is what is the trade-off there? And if we have this exemption or this sort of allowance, does it protect all of our view shed without protecting our food shed? And then my second follow-up is, what happens with, there's some big landowners in this area who own just a lot of land on mountainsides. And I know this is city specific, but I do think thinking about, again, this whole area, there's something to be said for thinking about those. If somebody owns just a bunch of steep stuff, and then the one tiny part of land that they have is like something else, rich agricultural soil, or just in general, like you could develop it into just a ton of really high-end condos, for instance, and make them really dense. And I don't know, I just think that there could be some nuances that I do appreciate Dave bringing up. And so I guess I'm not completely against the idea, but I would encourage us to look at our place and all of the steep slopes we have and think about what might be the impact if we say, if you're 80% steep slope, then you can put that much density on the one flat part, and what are we losing in that case too, because flat land's valuable as well. So yeah, just some thoughts and some things to think about, I guess.
I think those are good points. I'm wondering if like the language should just be extended to the to not. I don't think it uses the terms remove the lot reductions for hillsides and floodplains while prohibiting development on those sensitive lands. I mean, do we want to just extend the definition of sensitive lands to extend to lands that we want to preserve in some way, and that could in turn extend to prime agricultural soils and things like that? I mean, like taking it back to the hearing that we heard a few weeks ago, I mean, I know I might be in the minority here, but I did take exception to them developing on the hillside as much, it is at least as much, if not more so, to developing in the prime farm soil down at the bottom. But if they were able to develop, the 12 lots or whatever on a fraction of the allowable area, I would see that as a win, and while still preserving hillsides and prime agricultural land.
I mean, I thought it was, Stephanie's point, these are great points as well. I mean, it seems to me that increasing the density allowance through this provision, it wouldn't absolve any other requirements, right? Like if you have to have parkland or agricultural preservation or even streets, those aren't going away. So even though you might be allowed a density bonus, it might not be feasible to do to the maximum extent, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I think this is a very specific recommendation that is just about that calculation. It does not suggest changing anything else as it relates to city requirements. But I think what we can do is add a little bit of the kind of color from this conversation about what the code amendment kind of conversation might need to be should the city move forward with this recommendation.
Dave, you were trying to say something earlier. I want to give you a chance here. You're still muted.
Now it says I'm muted. What do you?
You're good. You were unmuted.
I'm good. Thank you. Sorry about that. Maybe I'm reaching too far. Now, other significant resources, such as floodplain or riparian areas that are identified and there's, say I've got 100 acres and 90 of it's in the floodplain, do I get credit for everything? Is this a new idea here? And just as long as I don't develop on the floodplain, I get all the density? It's not clear to me what you're doing with this issue. Sorry. So more. Tell me more.
Yeah. The way this is written right now is it is just a pretty straightforward, get rid of this reduction in your density calculation, period, right? Full stop. I think what we're hearing is maybe there are situations where this calculation shouldn't change based off of a very large lot size or a percentage of the lot that is within steep slopes or within a floodplain. I think we can provide some additional nuance here to address some of the comments that we've heard tonight.
Thank you.
I mean, would it be, and I guess this is maybe a question for the planning board, would it be better if there were like some guardrails on the sides of this? You know, you can get a density bonus up to, you know, an additional, you know, you can't exceed a density of more than twice what's allowable or something like that. Yet, so in the case of a 90% undevelopable lot, you can't increase the allowable density by more than an extra 100% or something like that.
I like the idea there, Shane, for sure. I don't think I'd be comfortable setting a number, but I mean, I think just as comments for Laval and Jessica and the team to look at those sort of edge cases that might come up, because I think that's on our minds here tonight.
Yeah.
My intention was not to set a number, is just to give some parameters to it, maybe, or at least give some thought to it.
Sure. This is Laval. I mean, one of the ways to think about this, I mean, you're using the word density bonus a lot, and in fact, these are zoning rights that are already there. Like it's the density of an overall parcel. And then what we're asking people to do is we either go through a density reduction exercise, and then, you know, also not build on those sensitive lands. So what this is about is not having to do the density reduction and still not build on those lands. And when you're talking about X% more on the developable lands, I'm taking that to mean it would be okay to move those rights around, but only up to a certain extent. Does that make sense? Like, I can see where the percentage can come in, but it's about moving a certain amount of those already established units out of the constrained or sensitive lands up to a certain amount. And then after that, it would be too much.
That's what I'm understanding from the rest of the board, and that's what I am also potentially advocating for. Although I would be fine looking at a case-by-case basis on allowing all the density on a smaller amount of land also. I know some of my colleagues seem hesitant in that regard though, so that would be fine.
Well, we have more work to do on this, obviously, and I mean, both in how it gets described here, and then future amendments into regulations when we actually start on those next steps. So you'll be hearing from us some more for sure.
Thanks, Laval. Yeah, I'm just as I'm thinking through what was just suggested there. I mean, you could imagine a situation in several neighborhoods in the city, the Rattlesnake or the South Hill or somewhere, Grant Creek, where by not doing the density or the reduction, by eliminating the reduction for hillsides, you'd allow a lot of density in a small portion of land that might be incompatible with the surrounding neighborhood. But it's not as if you'd allow like a 5-story building where it's not required, right? That wouldn't happen, right?
Right, they would still have to comply with the zoning in terms of building types and heights and setbacks. There are, I think you've even mentioned it yourself, there might be infrastructure constraints. There's street and road. I mean, in a way, there's what the market can do, and it has its own constraints.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sensitive to, I think it's a good idea to think about these edge cases and maybe putting on guardrails, as Shane said. But overall, and personally, as I think about it more, I'm more comfortable with it than I'm not, personally.
I guess I had one other comment on this concept, but would this almost or dovetail into needing some kind of a transfer of development rights? Because a property you had pointed out earlier that was just in front of the board a few weeks ago, if some of those boards were put in place, there would be no development potential on said property. It would either be caught in ag land or hillside. There's nowhere in between. So that person is stuck doing nothing, and the value of their property is left undeveloped, and they can't transfer development rights or anything else. That's a pickle I could see you putting some in if you get into that, those density computations. If you're going to protect the slopes and then the ag, there are parcels that will not have any opportunity.
Can I just chime in?
It's one now, though, isn't it?
Yeah, please, Lavelle.
Staff has to do that. I don't know how often, but they do have to trace back through the history of subdivision to ensure that some rights might have been moved from it starts as one parcel, and some rights have been moved to some creations and some have been limited. And overall, we're doing this calculation to say, okay, that parcel had 40 units. They've used their 40 units in various different ways, and now they're done. And sometimes that might mean it's a parcel that can't be developed, and they would require some kind of no-build terminology on that to, additionally recognize that in the subdivision process. And then we would have to go back through the history to recognize that all the rights have been used as well.
So I think we can make some adjustments based off of this conversation. This was a really good conversation on this. So thank you. And we just have, I think, 3 more slides to get through on the full recommendation. So next one is updating code to allow parking reductions in certain areas. When we wrote this report, the reductions for parking with ADUs had not been adopted yet. That has since been adopted, and so we'll be updating the report to reflect that. But also, we think there's an opportunity to potentially expand the approach to parking requirements that's currently in the Design Excellence Overlay, as well as in the Central Business District. This is pretty standard best practice for communities, particularly in areas that have good transportation service and good connectivity through trails and sidewalks.
Jessica,
recommendation. Oh, go ahead.
Were you intending to change to another slide by any chance? CP9 or we're still on the old slide? Yeah. Great. Now it looks correct.
I don't know what happened there. Okay. Apologies. So yeah, CP9 is about parking. And then recommendation 10 is related to the park dedication requirements. Park dedication is another area that is pretty detailed within state law. There's a number of opportunities to update these requirements. I think one of the things to look at is updating the dedication standard to match some of the requirements in state law when you don't know the density of a project. We've heard pretty consistently some frustration about the cash in lieu process and how that works as it relates to parks dedication. And so we're suggesting as a short-term recommendation that that be updated and really clarified for both the city and the development community on when cash in lieu payment is appropriate and how that is calculated. And then for some medium and long-term recommendations, we do think that there are opportunities for cash in lieu to be allowed by right for really small parks dedications. Missoula would need to have a conversation on what does small mean to you. In other communities, we've seen if a requirement is less than 2 acres, the cash in lieu is by right, but it is really community dependent. We also think that there's maybe an opportunity to influence state law and link park requirements back to a parks master plan. We think this is a way to potentially create some more equity in parks access, but is something that is a long-term recommendation because it would require some conversation and advocacy at the state level. So pause there and see if there's questions on these two.
Jessica, I think these are both great recommendations, particularly the parking reduction one. I think it's really sensible to do. We've seen it at the planning board in my time here in lots of different scenarios. And I think the ones that you mentioned in your recommendation for short-term or eliminating requirements for ADUs makes a lot of sense. I'm curious if you considered specifically mentioning on-street parking, allowing on-street parking to be used in certain situations like corner lots, which has seemed to me really sensible.
Yeah, we haven't included some of that here, but I do think that that makes sense as probably a medium-term recommendation to look at situations where on-street parking could be allocated or counted as part of a development. And that would be kind of a policy conversation to have at that time, but it is a best practice in communities as it relates to parking.
Vince, if I could just to follow up on that, to add on, that is something that's included in the design excellence overlay. So in most of the sub-districts in the design excellence overlay, credits given for meeting parking requirements that includes, on-street parking that's adjacent to the site.
Oh, well, thanks for that, Ben. I didn't realize that. And so, yeah, when the recommendations, it looked like it might have made sense to have a middle ground between abolishing parking requirements as we do in the CBD to some middle ground. But if the design excellence includes that, then I think it's probably already captured. It might be worth reiterating it here for, anyway. But
I think so, because that nuance is really not included in how we've written this right now. I think it's a good inclusion.
Well, and the design excellence doesn't apply in many of the areas around town either. So it seems to be important to maybe include here. And I guess I also, following up on what Vince said, I wonder if there's a way to even go a little bit more nuanced to encourage alley access parking and things like that by, I'm not exactly sure how it would be worded, but eliminating the width of the driveway as a parking option on the street in order to encourage folks to park from the rear, which would then encourage more walkable neighborhoods and less forward-facing garages and things like that.
That's a great point, Shane. They're really related.
I have some questions or some concerns about the park dedication requirements. I seem to remember a conversation when the park director came and talked to us about cash in lieu options, that you couldn't determine where that money was going to go. That was really up to the park district. And I'm not sure how much of do these provisions, the CP10 provisions, apply only to the TED pieces, or do they apply more generally? It seems like a huge issue. I'm not sure how. Are we just hoping that through this process we're making it a little clearer altogether, and a little? Yeah, do you get my point? I'm not sure where we are in the spectrum with this.
Yeah, this is a recommendation that is broader than really just subdivision and TED, though that's really where you have the requirements from state law. So that's where that linkage is. But we are suggesting a kind of broader look and just clarification on these requirements. We haven't gotten into any detail, and I don't expect that we would, about where a cash in lieu payment goes as part of this report. But it's a good point as you're updating those regulations, having some clarity and understanding about that.
Yeah, it seems to me we had this. You mentioned this earlier about having an advocate throughout the process and the development. I really think it's important that we have, some kind of a advocate in this process. Maybe it is the parks director in Missoula, but if we're going to talk about Missoula County, how do we? I don't know. Gosh, I admire your willingness to approach this topic, but it seems huge to me. Sorry.
It is, and this is one, I think, parks dedication, the neighborhood meeting, and TEDS are where there's a lot of different recommendations, because they are some of the more complex pieces of the Missoula process and the subdivision process. And so there's lots of different ways you could tackle those and work to improve them.
I just recommend for the appraisal recommendation, did you consider requiring like a review appraisal? So there's appraisal and then an independent review of that appraisal. It's a process that's used at the federal level that seems to, work out some of the issues that you describe in the report.
Great. Okay. Right, the last three recommendations in the code and state law section are related to, first, to our exemptions. Adopt the subdivision infrastructure and growth policy exemption. One of the really important things is no community has adopted this exemption because it is pretty complex. So we've suggested as a short-term recommendation that the city really work to understand the requirements for this infrastructure exemption, what type of mapping, what type of research, what type of data is needed to really implement this. And then if that is not overly burdensome, to adopt that into the city's regulation. Recommendation 12 is to make some updates to the cluster subdivision exemption. There are some opportunities to create a more streamlined process as it relates to cluster subdivisions. We also think this is an area to tie in some of the policy documents and statements about the preservation of agricultural lands and really focusing cluster subdivisions on areas that will meet those community goals. And then making sure that the timelines are consistent with state law. Our final recommendation in this section is, I would say if we had to pick one that we believe the most strongly in, it is the adoption of a Unified Development Ordinance, or a UDO. Right now, there are requirements buried in lots of different sections of Missoula's code. It is complex and hard to understand for a developer, for a professional planner, let alone for a community member. And having some clarity in what regulations are the regulation to follow when you've got some maybe conflicting ones is really important. And that UDO helps create hierarchy and alignment within the code. A lot of the kind of questions and that we've gotten tonight and talked through could be addressed through the UDO. So if you're doing a Unified Development Ordinance, you really don't need a development process manual, because your code has actually articulated what is that process, what piece of the code has seniority, so to speak, over other pieces when there's a conflict. So I'll leave it at that. Can go into more detail on UDO if you'd like, but those are our last three in this section of the recommendations report.
Jessica, could you just give maybe, if you could, like an example of how the current regulations are spread out throughout the code? Because my understanding was that there was a big move to put everything in Title 20 a long time ago. I'm just curious what it actually looks like.
So what's happened is there are regulations that have been adopted twice. So some of the requirements in subdivision have also been adopted in Title 20 as it relates to TED. And so that is just redundancy that creates additional pages within your development piece. The other piece of this is when you have a requirement from engineering or public works that is outside of Title 20, there's a question on what is the regulation that you have to comply with. And the UDO can help articulate that by kind of pulling some of these things into one place. The development process manual also helps do that. So that's kind of if you're not wanting to go to a full Unified Development Ordinance and really updating everything, I think you go with the development process manual.
Can I just add on top of that?
Please.
Because I love this topic. We actually took some things out of the Title 20 when we did our rewrite over 10 years ago, because we were looking at zoning code not as the code that does everything for everybody when it comes to, a building development, but what do we need to know around zoning and building placement that is then reviewed for compliance, et cetera, in the permits and zoning expertise. And then some of those other things end up back over in engineering, like grading and drainage. And then we got a pretty robust stormwater management division that took on the stormwater regulations and developed their set using some of those original pieces and some pieces from engineering and what they needed to have to deal with state law, et cetera. You will find that there might be different definitions of something like what are the cutoffs for certain types of standards, whether it's 2 units on a parcel or 3 units on a parcel. So some of those are things that you can get consistent. You'll get consistent terminologies. And, you know, it's part of just the fact that we've been growing as a community and creating these extra programs, but also extra regulations. And the UDO will give us the opportunity, kind of like what the Public Works Manual does for the technical side of things, to really align all of the steps together. That's one of my examples or my take, and that's not very specific because I can't quite recall, but these are some of the things that come to mind for me and we would see opportunity in.
Can I give a specific example?
We all love it.
I think this is,
Thank you.
Can be illustrated. Comes to mind for me would be, so with zoning, if you're gonna build a garage, in most zoning districts, you're gonna have probably a 3-foot setback, maybe a 5-foot setback from the rear property line, which, you know, you would look at if you were gonna build a garage or an ADU or whatnot. But if you're gonna back out, if you're gonna leave the garage headed, you know, out of the property towards the alley, there's a back distance requirement where you need to provide enough room to back your car around without crossing the neighboring properties or the property across the alley without crossing their property line. And that's found in Title 12. That's the engineering code, except that actually it's a standard technical drawing, which I think has been moved to the Public Works Manual, which is where we're working on consolidating, you know, that type of schematics and drawing and information like that. And so it's kind of a moving target effect where, you know, I can't tell you how many conversations I had at the zoning desk where someone would come in and say, where can I build, you know, this garage? And then we'd say, well, you can build it here, except you need to go talk to this person in engineering and, you know, they're going to measure the alley width and they're going to move it back, you know, another 3, maybe 6 or 8 feet for their standards. So that kind of thing.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, okay, so I think I have a sense for how this could be really messy and having things strewn throughout different sections of the city code that, yeah, might conflict with each other in intent and practice.
You just get used to it after a while.
All right. Our last 3 recommendations are related to programs and policy. So the first one is creating some incentives for affordable housing. Those could be tied either to home price or unit type, could be tied to density. There's lots of different ways to tie this, but some of the ideas that we've included in the recommendations report, you might have an expedited building permit review. You may have some waiver of fees, some reductions in land set asides. There's lots of ways to do this, but we think that that's a policy conversation that the city should have, and then potentially updating the code. Second recommendation is creating research materials for habitat, slopes, geotechnical issues, some of those technical things, just to really understand what is out there and what is really truly developable land in the future, what type of lands need to be preserved from an agricultural perspective, from a wildlife or wildfire perspective. So it's really kind of a planning exercise. And then the final recommendation is creating a hierarchy for our policies based off of the policy documents as well as based off of geography. And so again, kind of analyzing land and community assets where they could be targeted for some special policy guidance to support the development of affordable housing or other city priorities, potentially creating a plan that coordinates with zoning policy. So really kind of implementing that growth policy and housing within zoning, And then finally, there's potentially an opportunity to advocate for some state level policies and adjustments related to promoting affordable housing in areas where there's infrastructure and services. Those are the last 3 recommendations in the report.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation, Jessica.
Kind of a slog, but we really appreciate the time. So in terms of kind of our steps to the final report, we had this meeting. We're really interested in any specific feedback that the planning board might have. And so if you have thoughts that come to you in the middle of the night, if you've got a chance to read the recommendations report and can provide some comments, we'd love to get those to Laval by November 6th. And then we'll be presenting the final document to LUP on November 18th.
Laval.
This is Jessica. Should I send the planning board members a comment log?
Yeah, that'd be great.
You know, of the Word document as a way to provide detailed comments back to us. Would that kind of help get the system? Okay. So look for an email from me or through Donna. That will be the document you already have, which is a PDF. But I'll send it to you as a Word document. If you have comments you want to make on the sidebars or track changes, you could do it that way, or a comment log sheet that you can enter comments in and then send those back to me by November 6th.
Could I make a plug also that for anyone who's watching this that is interested or wants to comment, that we have a page up on the Engage Missoula website. It's engagemissoula.com, and you can find the project specific page on that and make comments through there as well.
Right, there's an idea board that you can use to add comments, and we welcome what we can hear.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks Laval and Ben for being here for this too. It was really helpful to have your perspective on this. I think when we first were introduced to this project earlier in the year or whenever it was, it didn't really, come alive for me. I think maybe other planning board members exactly where this was going and what the purpose was. But after tonight and reviewing the materials, I mean, there's a ton of great and sensible recommendations in here. So it's really, really exciting to see. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your time. We really appreciate it. And again, if you've got comments, we would love to get those. We can incorporate them.
I've been really appreciative of this process because I think it's been, we've been able to discover things that I don't think we would have done if we would have just said, okay, now's the time, go in and review your subdivision regs and update them. Here we've really had an opportunity with Jessica and Design Workshop's help to do that deeper dive and collect a lot of great insights over many different processes and evaluations. So it's going to really enrich how we can improve our processes, some that don't take regulation at all. And so some that might be sooner, some that are going to take a lot more commitment, but this lays it out for everybody. So it's going to be really, we're going to be informed on what we're doing.
Yeah, that's great. That's absolutely great. It seemed really useful here to have an outside perspective too. It's just to help collate ideas and things that folks internally might be harder to see, and also to incorporate best practices nationally, which the report did all those things really well. So nice job.
Thank you. Thank you, Design Workshop.
This has been fun.
All right, so we don't have, we'll move on with the agenda. There is not very much left tonight. That was the only special presentation or communication we have. Well, do we have any committee reports? I guess, Peter, have you been to any meetings since last week?
Thankfully, no.
Okay. All right, so no committee reports. There is no old business or new business, but we may have comments from planning board members. Would any of you like to make a comment on anything at all?
I just know this is Stephanie's last meeting, I believe, if I got that calendar right. So thank you, Stephanie, again, for calling in and being here, and all of your hard work. We'll really miss you.
I second that.
I third that. Stephanie, we're going to miss you. I think tonight showed a lot of the reasons why. It's been really great to have you serve with you on the board. So thank you.
I just want to add, on the previous presentation, I didn't thank the city staff and the consultants for really getting into it. A lot of good stuff there. That's brings back both good and bad memories from long ago, but great job so far. They're really on it, and I appreciate the city willing to have, you know, outside eyes on it and combining with really good staff. We're on a good track here. So thank you, everybody.
I had one sort of thought that's kind of percolating about the parks business. And I remember when we had a conversation about the the big planning that Andrew Hagemeyer did of the sort of large Missoula area. We talked about, you know, riparian areas that went throughout the whole thing, and how do we connect them? How do we preserve particular natural resources or game trails that aren't just specific to one particular neighborhood, but went through a large part of the county? And how do we, you know, facilitate paying attention to those kind of details? And it struck me that our conversation about the parks is pretty much the same way, you know. And Stephanie had mentioned this. I remember very clearly, you know, one of the intentions of the park district was that a kid could walk less than some amount of, you know, quarter a mile, some number of feet to get to a local park that was safe. And I hope that we can somehow facilitate, I don't know if it's our job or somebody else's job, but facilitate the general overview of our park districts, you know, and whether it's important to include byways, you know, and trails through the whole city. I don't know if that's our business or not.
Well, it seemed, Peter, that their long-term recommendation to change the state law to allow impact fees to fund projects in a parks master plan seemed to me like that would kind of get at what you're talking about. And that might well happen, you know, in some of our time on the planning board. So, or even not. I mean, if the city, I don't know how that process looks.
What was
really,
the fellow who's in Cleveland who planned all the parks in Cleveland? He's a naturalist who was incredibly influential in, you know, our paying attention to the environment. Teddy Roosevelt thought this was important. You know, I think, yeah, anyway.
Ian McHarg is your leader on that, right? In your early readings. Parks planning, yes.
Great. Any other comments from folks? All right. Well, thanks to all of you. Great discussion tonight. Hope you have a nice few weeks, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you again for an extra day with us.
Our pleasure, Lavelle.